Like the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, the rule changes implemented following the 2004-2005 lockout, designed to open up the game and end the dead puck era, would also mark the end of the age of the Enforcer. Like those dinosaurs, the Enforcers would cling to their existence for a few more years, refusing to go quietly into the night. But by the early 2010s, just 5 years after the age of grapple and hold hockey had come to a merciful end, it was apparent there was no longer a place in teams' bottom three for a player slow of foot and fast of fist. The game was just too quick now, the need to roll lines consistently too immediate. Icing Enforcers became a zero-sum game for an opponent. Tough players had to diversify, they had to grind and they had to contribute. They had to be faster. If you permit me to elongate the metaphor a little further, the late 90s and early 2000s was the final moments of the Enforcer. The moment for the dinosaurs that the Chicxulub meteor entered the atmosphere. And in many ways, like the dinosaurs, it was the Enforcer's zenith, when the role had been distilled down into its purest form. Large players with almost zero offensive upside, who'd rarely play more than 5 minutes, skated like Bambi and hit like a truck. They were fan favourites. There was a sense of anticipation the moment they lumbered onto the ice, and even more so when the opposing team's Enforcer also entered the fray. It would be slightly reductive to say all the Enforcers of the 90s and early 2000s were formed from the same mould. Some of the team's Enforcers were bottom pair defensemen, some offered a modicum of offensive potential. Hell, some had been quality players in juniors who'd been converted into Enforcers. But the archetype, the type of player fans loved in the late 90s and who they think of when they think back to the Enforcers of the day, were the type of specialised Enforcers whose primary draw in an era of turgid hockey was to face off with the other team's tough guy and have a Donnybrook at centre ice. It was an era of staged fights, a bygone age many fans grew misty-eyed for and decried the game had become soft in the years since the Enforcer became functionally extinct. And then, on February 16th, 2024, the New York Rangers called up Matt Rempe.
It's unbelievable. He has this magic power to be the story no matter what.
He's making a name for himself. Everyone's talking about him. He's on the cover of the paper in New York City. Are you kidding me?
Remarkable run, Frank. It's from Ragin' Rempe. He just can't be stopped.
The Rempire State Building.
This Matt Rempe phenomenon. Matt Rempe has caught everybody's attention. Everybody knows the name.
How does a fourth line player icing little more than 5 minutes a game end up sucking up all the oxygen in NHL discourse for the best part of 3 months? More if you count all the lineup speculation that followed the Rangers throughout their run to the conference finals. What transforms a marginal prospect so marginal that in the 2023-24 season primer for the Hockey News, you're not listed amongst the team's top 10 prospects, nor even as a B-grade prospect, into the darling of Broadway and Madison Square Garden amid a team brimming with talent?
Verhage stopped at the line by Trouba. Listen to the Garden Joe. They love him. Chanting Rempe. They love him. Guy's been here for 2 weeks. He's a hero.
Have you ever seen the film Jurassic Park? Of course you have. Everyone has. And I intend to bring this metaphor to death. All 6'8" of Matt Rempe stepping onto the ice in a winter classic against the crosstown rivals no less, and dropping gloves with the Islanders' Matt Martin on his first ever shift in the league was a statement of intent he would follow up the next game, and then the next. Matt Rempe was like those dinosaurs revived from the DNA of that mosquito, only his DNA seemed to have been drawn from those Enforcers of old, encased in amber from the long ago days of the late 90s and early 2000s. 4 fights in 5 games later and Rempemania was in full swing. Certain pundits claimed Matt Rempe had solidified the Rangers' identity.
Johnny Lazarus on my show yesterday said he completely changed the identity of the New York Rangers, which I think is an insane overreach.
Not Artemi Panarin, nor Mika Zibanejad, nor Igor Shesterkin. No, The lumbering, gangly Alberta boy made good, icing barely 5 minutes on a President's Trophy team. He was the core of the Rangers' newfound identity. Suddenly, every sports radio show was talking about him. He was on the front pages of New York newspapers. There was an infinite sense of anticipation as fans of all teams looked at the Rangers' upcoming lineup and circled potential dance partners for Rempe. Rempemania was born from a series of factors. Matt Rempe is a likeable kid. He always comes off incredibly pleasant in his interviews. He also stands out. At 6'8", it's impossible to not notice him on the ice, and if his size doesn't betray him, his skating certainly does. He doesn't look like he should be out there, and that's a big part of the appeal. Every fan loves a player who plays tough, but Rempe takes that to the next level. His sheer size, his insistence on finishing checks, and of course, more than anything, his willing to fight. Wherever you stand on the debate on fighting in hockey, fans love it. Maybe not all, but most. Rempe is a throwback to the enforcers of old, the Scott Parkers, the Peter Worrells, the Derek Boogaards and the Colton Orrs. Players rendered obsolete by rules implemented essentially to counter tactics that had made hockey slow and often dull, an era that required extracurricular entertainment in the form of heavyweight enforcers. And yet a decade removed from the last pure enforcers, here was Matt Rempe, like Jean Reno in Just Visiting, a relic in the modern day. But it wasn't always this way for Matt Rempe.
I want this to be a good story because here's a kid, Canadian kid, Calgary, like literally takes the NHL by storm. Seems like a really nice kid. His interviews have been really good.
He's become a revelation. It's pretty fitting he's doing this on Broadway. Rangers fans I know love him.
No, I love it. I love this kid. You know why I love it? And people can say, okay, we don't need fighting in our game anymore. Okay, whatever.
Born in Calgary, Alberta, Rempe grew up a Flames fan. His father, Ron Rempe, had been a season ticket holder who'd wanted to play hockey as a kid, but his German immigrant family had been unable to afford it. Still, Ron Rempe had dragged himself up from humble beginnings to form an engineering company from the ground up, and with that had been able to fund Matt's hockey ambitions. Matt Rempe has often spoke of his father as his biggest hero and best friend. Tragically, while Rempe played with the Okanagan Hockey Academy under-16s, his father would suffer a fatal heart attack. Rempe, brother to two sisters, suddenly found himself the man of the house, just months before the 2018 WHL Bantam draft for which he would be eligible. Rempe, already significantly larger than his draft class, instead went undrafted. His numbers at Okanagan were distinctly unremarkable, including his penalty minutes, but given the circumstances it was unsurprising. Despite going undrafted, Rempe accepted a training camp tryout offer from the Seattle Thunderbirds and survived until the final cuts. With it obvious he wouldn't be playing in the major juniors that year, Rempe packed his bags and joined the Spruce Grove Saints in the Alberta Junior Hockey League just months after the passing of his father. Rempe cites his season in the AJHL as an opportunity to realise what he needed to work on to improve his game, getting the ice time to develop. Still, despite the ice time, Rempe would only post 12 points in 43 AJHL games. Even as a rookie, those numbers didn't set Rempe out from the pack in minor junior, yet he would once again accept an offer to try out with the Seattle Thunderbirds ahead of the 2019-20 WHL season, and this time, with his time maturing in the Alberta League, he made the team out of camp. In fact, not only did he make the team, but as an 18-year-old logged 31 points in 47 games, as well as 53 penalty minutes, which in 2019-20 was good enough for 82nd most penalised player in the WHL. Although, to be fair, he had missed 15 games due to injury as he was still growing into his size, and the Thunderbirds had had a weak season. Rempe was in fact their 6th best scorer and would probably have been their 5th had it not been for his injuries. Given these caveats that surrounded Rempe's season in a poor Thunderbirds side, the New York Rangers saw enough in the kid to draft him in the 6th round, 165th overall. By the following season, now one of the more senior players on the Thunderbirds roster, Rempe would be awarded an assistant captain's role, but like many young prospects, COVID would eradicate his chance to build on that draft momentum. In his final season, Rempe would retain the A, and the effective lost season of the 2020-21 had allowed Rempe to become more comfortable in his size and continue to work on his game. Prior to the 2021-22 season, the newly drafted Rempe would be invited to his first Rangers preseason camp and make the initial cut, but would ultimately be assigned back to his junior team. Despite his experiences with the Rangers, 2021-22 would be a backstep for Rempe in his final junior season. 2 years of bantam drafts and opportunities for younger players to mature saw Rempe fall down the Thunderbirds' pecking order, and he found himself being shuffled between centre and the wing. He would post just 23 points in 56 games on a Thunderbirds team that would surprise many on the way to the WHL finals, Rempe playing a supporting role in the team's unlikely passage through the playoffs. Finding his role as an offensive spearhead diminished, 2021-22 would be the year Rempe would start to pivot into a more physical game. It's often the case at junior level that the tallest players, particularly the unusually tall, struggle to harness their size early on and take longer to develop, and for Rempe, it was apparent that to make the NHL, he would have to adapt his game to his size. Rempe would be involved in 7 fights in the WHL, having rarely been involved in fights in the seasons prior. In his final junior season, Rempe posted a team-leading 93 penalty minutes, making him the 14th most penalised player in the WHL. He was, however, the only Thunderbird who posted a negative plus-minus in both the regular and postseason. Despite his fluctuating numbers, Rempe would be signed by the Rangers in November 2021, having started the season strong with 4 goals in 10 games and having made an impression at his first Rangers camp. Rempe would later say Tom Wilson was a player he idolised growing up, and it seemed Rempe was intent on modelling certain elements of his game on Wilson, who made his NHL debut when Rempe was just 10 years old. During the 2022-23 Rangers development camp, Rempe fought the Philadelphia Flyers' Wade Allison, a player 5 years his senior with NHL experience. It is worth noting, however, as there's been some mythologising over this incident, that Allison was never a fighter. He gave up 6 inches of reach on Rempe and more than held his own, leaving Rempe bleeding. However, Rempe's willing to stand up for his teammates did leave a mark on the Rangers brass, despite Rempe being assigned to Hartford. Rempe would go on to have an unremarkable first season in the AHL, posting just 10 points, the lowest of any forward playing more than 23 games, and in fact Rempe played more than double that. But did have a team-leading 87 penalty minutes, and this was good enough for 42nd in the AHL, and did involve 9 fights. And that would be a trend that would continue in the 2023-24 training camp, where Rempe would engage in 2 fights before being assigned to the AHL, where he would continue to drop the gloves against some of the most notable AHL heavyweights. Yet, despite all this, Rempe had never been a full-time enforcer. His fights were generally well spread out. He wasn't chucking knucks every night like a throwback. That was until he was called up to the NHL. Laviolette obviously liked what he saw in Rempe as a pure chaos factor, as someone who would stand up for his teammates, but by now Rempe had evolved from a lanky young forward with a modicum of offensive upside as seen in his debut season in Seattle, to a bottom 6 AHLer who had to find a way to stay up in the NHL. So far, this has all been relatively positive. A likeable kid with tragedy in his past gets a shot in the NHL on a dominant team despite a limited skill set and an unremarkable stats sheet. Said kid goes on to become a media sensation out of nowhere by channeling enforcers of old. But it's here we're going to speed wobble. Because Matt Rempe also became a lightning rod for controversy, not just because of the hits he was making, but because it opened up a wider debate, one that is never dead and one that causes certain fans' eyes to roll so hard they fall out the back of their head. Violence in hockey and its merits.
There used to be 5 guys on a team like Rempe. Now there's not even 10 guys in the league like him.
One of the things that's been lost is the anticipation of a big scrap in hockey.
He would have been perfect in the 90s. We're in like the 2020s now.
But before we deal with that, I feel it's necessary to define what an enforcer is, or more specifically, what I think an enforcer is. Because in the days since the pure enforcers died out, the types of player Matt Rempe indeed mimics, the definition of enforcer has morphed. Because while I can claim a pure enforcer has died out, there are viewers younger than my 39-year-old self who will say enforcers are still very much part of the game. And in some ways they would be right, just not in the way they mean. Since the extinction of pure enforcers in the NHL, the role has lumbered on in the minors. There are enforcers who have still had limited careers in the ECHL, the SPHL, the FPHL, and the LNAH, and to a much lesser extent the AHL. They provide popular draws in small town markets. Daniel Amesbury is a good example who's been making the rounds on social media the last few years to the glee of old school fans. These are players who are very much old school nuisances, and since Goonery has largely dropped away in European leagues that used to welcome them, such as the British Elite League and the dustbin teams of the KHL, their only option is non-league professional minor league hockey in North America. But in the NHL, what is often described as an enforcer today is so far from the specialised role it once was, it's really becoming a meaningless title, ceremonially awarded to a player who might drop the gloves a handful of times a year in concert with their role as a grinding bottom six player. For those who aren't rapidly approaching middle age like myself, they might not remember the types of player I am referring to. So this is my basic definition of an enforcer. And like all poor definitions, be they personal or widely accepted definitions, I reserve the right to adopt vagaries that encompass other players. And for anyone that doesn't like that, shut up, it's my video. You can argue with me down below in the comments after liking and subscribing. Lord knows I need the engagement. So what do I think of as a pure enforcer? For me, a pure enforcer, as typified by the type of players that roamed the NHL prior to the meteor impact of the 2004-05 lockout, was a player who averaged at least 3 penalty minutes a game, despite rarely skating more than 5 minutes, and provided next to no offensive upside, averaging around 0.1 point per game. They were often visibly the worst skater on the ice, the poorest passer and the weakest puck handler. But more specifically, they were the type of player that came with the expectations of a fight whenever they were on the ice with another pure enforcer. Players like, and this is not an exhaustive list, Scott Parker, Peter Worrell, Gino Odjick, Bob Probert, Chris Oliver, Dale Purinton, Wade Belak, Louis DeBrusque, Todd Ewan, Chris Nealon, Stu Grimson, Matt Johnson, Darren Langdon, Marty McSorley, Nick Kyprios, Joey Coker, Chris Simon, Andrei Nazarov, Tony Twist, Rob Ray, Donald Brashear. And even in that group, there are outliers. Probert, Nealon, Simon, Nazarov, and Brashear were not functionally useless as offensive threats, and were closer to earlier enforcers like Tiger Williams, Nick Fatu, and Dave Semenko, who, like the modern-day enforcer, were not one-dimensional players. In the age of Williams, Fatu, and Semenko, the enforcer role was nebulous and had yet to be rigidly defined or specialised. They were just extra hard players in a sea of hard players. The irony of many players in that halcyon era of pure enforcery were competent scorers in junior hockey. Later players managed to keep the flame alive after the lockout. Georges Larac was a bridge between the eras and was joined by the likes of George Parros, Derek Bugard, Colton Orr and John Scott, perhaps the last primary enforcer. All were throwbacks. A mark of the enduring popularity of the role was the grassroots campaign to get John Scott elected to the NHL All-Star Game, an event that made the NHL All-Star event worth watching purely due to its absurdity. The irony of this last group were few of them put up numbers in juniors and had distilled the role into its purest form. However, their offensive numbers were more a mark of how the game had changed, even at a junior level, but it was clear the value of players with such a limited skill set in an ever faster and more open league were increasingly diminished. Regardless of how you personally define an enforcer, the age of the pure enforcer effectively ended when John Scott retired, and really before. Teams have toyed with bringing up players like Joel Reklich, but prior to the arrival of Matt Rempe, we hadn't seen a player this ilk in almost a decade. There will be people who argue that Curtis McDermott, Liam O'Brien or Ryan Reeves are enforcers, and they are. McDermott is certainly the closest to the old mould, but they're modern enforcers who also fulfill other roles in the bottom six or bottom pairing. There's only so much runway to play a pure enforcer in the modern game, and the Rangers are testing that runway. Because the reason Rempe is popular is he is channeling a different style of game, an outdated one, and while people may argue one way or the other, Rempe is a uniquely limited player, which is why he has garnered the level of attention he has. He's slow, he's a poor puck handler, and he likes to chuck knucks and dirty hits, be it accidental or otherwise. He's an oddity on the ice, and while people will point to his height, there are other large players in the NHL. Rempe is uniquely ungainly. None of the upside Rempe offers is anything different to the enforcers of old. He's a nuisance in the corners when he gets there, and he is excellent at screening goalies and holding his ground around the crease. But to be honest, if you're 6'8 and 240 pounds, you should be. But the bad penalties are where the truest limitations of Rempe's NHL career will be tested in a game that has ostensibly moved away from the role he is trying to fill. But there was another debate I was talking about, one where Rempe's less savoury hits and intent to fight regularly have called into question the long-term viability of his role.
He's going to have a short career.
You worry about the health risk, you worry about repeated blows to the head.
And you have to just think for life after hockey for a 21-year-old kid.
He is doing potentially serious damage to himself.
Go through what, in the 90s and the 2000s when we loved it and it was awesome.
We know a lot. We just know so much more about head trauma than we did even in the 90s and the 2000s.
I can imagine many now smashing dislike, but I want to caveat something it feels many who try and have this conversation have to caveat. I don't want to legislate violence from hockey, but I do think we need to have a sensible debate because we know so much more today than we did in the days of Bob Probert or even Derek Boogaard. And right now, the NHL is far behind the NFL in dealing with this issue or providing support for players after their careers. Rempemania began to sour pretty quickly for those outside the Rangers bubble due to two key factors. Rempe is a 21-year-old playing in a man's league fighting almost every night and, well, not being that great at it, or at the least not great at defending himself, as evidenced when he fought the Blue Jackets' Matthew Olivier, and was left wobbly just 9 days after his call-up and 3 fights in. And Rempe also shares many of the characteristics of the enforcers of the late 90s and early 2000s, the slow foot speed, continually being behind the play as a result, and a desire to finish checks. We all love seeing players finish checks. It's part of the game. It makes defenders make bad passes, rushes the play, and allows a team to stamp their authority on the game. Back in the late 90s, when the likes of Peter Worrell, who also stood at 6'7", took to the ice, the game was glacially slow in comparison to today. Worrell was slow, but the grapple and hold of the day meant he could make a check before getting into a fight. The game isn't slow now, and Rempe can often be seen skating out of camera shot to finish his check as a play moves in the opposite direction, and many of those checks have been, like the aforementioned Worrell, late, dirty checks. And part of the problem is players today are just not used to getting checked in the way Rempe is approaching the game, which is another debate entirely. Too many players like to admire their pass and puck watch. But Rempe has to be aware of that, if for no other reason than to stop taking stupid penalties. The shots of Rempe post the Olivier fight with 2 black eyes as a 21-year-old meant for many the fun was already coming to an end. Rempe burst into the league was a sensation, but now he was getting visibly hurt. Nobody expects young enforcers to come into the league and do the tour like Brashear and Probert once did. Rempe seemed to be doing it all on his own. Other teams' tough guys who'd been dying for a dance partner were licking their lips. But people were saying it was unsustainable. Some people wanted him to stop. There's many reasons the role of enforcer had gone the way of the rover. The game had changed, had sped up, but there were other reasons. Reasons the hockey community likes to dance around and is paved in a legacy of tragedies. Of players who left this world too soon or ended up homeless. Brent Sopel says we shouldn't listen to the talk about CTE and instead should focus on the NHL providing great support to the players after their careers. I would argue both should be spoken about. The age of the enforcer effectively died post-lockout due to rule changes, but nominally the summer of 2011 was when the realities of the role began to come home to roost. 3 NHLers with lengthy fight cards all died in their 20s or 30s, one of suicide, one of an accidental painkiller overdose, and one undetermined. Rick Rippon, Derek Boogaard, and Wade Belak. The summer prior, legendary enforcer Bob Probert had died of a heart attack aged just 45. Probert was of a different vintage to the rest, an enforcer who could play, who could put up numbers, a verified NHL legend, an enforcer who'd made it to almost 1,000 games in the NHL and had fought over 200 times in his career. So what? Many fans, and effectively even the NHL, said, all tragic in their own right, but none of them had died of brain damage. Except all 4 were diagnosed post-mortem with CTE, a degenerative brain disorder caused by repeated blows to the head and concussions. All had begun to display symptoms common in sufferers of CTE. Boogaard was also struggling with painkiller addiction due to his role as an enforcer. Rempemania and Belak both struggled with depression. Probert was beginning to show signs of early onset dementia at 45, with memory loss and mood swings. For those who shit on the links between CTE and enforcing, Bob Probert was pretty convinced, as has been Ty Domi and Dan Carcillo, with Carcillo vowing to do as Bob Probert did and donate his brain for medical study alongside the likes of Ben Lovejoy and Jonathan Huberdeau. For those who love to bury their head in the sand, they're always pretty quick to invoke the name of Bob Probert as a legend of fighting who wouldn't want the game to go soft. But Bob Probert had already vowed to donate his brain before his unexpected death. Like Domi, he knew the game had damaged him. In 2015, Steve Montador, who'd fought nearly 70 times in the NHL and suffered 19 concussions, died aged 35, having already begun to show signs of mental decline. And like Boogaard, Montador struggled with substance abuse. And like Probert, Montador struggled with memory loss and mood swings. And like Rempemania and Belak, Montador struggled with depression. The sports world has been aware of CTE since 2005, when forensic pathologist Bennet Amalu and his colleagues at the Department of Pathology at the University of Pittsburgh published the paper CTE in a National Football League player in the journal Neurosurgery. Amalu and his department had been studying the brain of Mike Webster, an NFL center who'd played for the Steelers and the Chiefs and had passed away in 2002 aged 50 after years of being homeless, struggling with depression and eventually dementia. To this day, the NHL continues to deny the links between fighting, concussions, hockey, and CTE. To this day, both the NHL and the NFL are fighting lawsuits due to the studies of Bennet Amalu, putting them in the position in which they have to continue to deny the links rather than find solutions, as that could be deemed an admittance of guilt. Indeed, after the NHL reached a settlement with 300 retired players in 2018 totaling $19 million in damages, Donald Fair, the Players Association director, stated, "I'm glad for the parties that it's all over. Hopefully people can go on with their lives and now we can perhaps deal with these issues with the NHL without having to worry about the effect on the litigation." The NFL has taken a more progressive stance towards CTE, changing rules and improving equipment in an effort to head off crippling future lawsuits at the pass. Sadly, this is not the direction the NHL wants to go, as the league commissioner continues to deny links with CTE to this day, and for all those who continue to say the NHL is soft, well, it will continue to be until the NHL tackles this issue rather than trying to legislate its way around it.
Everything I've been told, and if anybody has information to the contrary, we'd be happy to hear it. Other than some anecdotal evidence, there has not been that a conclusive link.
One of the most common refrains you will hear from fans of fighting in hockey is that it's not the fighting that causes CTE, but players hitting, which is applying NFL thinking to the NHL because they don't fight in the NFL. But they also impact each other head first, which is fucking stupid, and any rugby fan who accuses NFL players of being soft has to understand that the contact involved in both sports is very different, and the contact involved in the NFL is predominantly because of the equipment. But as a counterpoint, it is simply not borne out in the evidence. Of the NHL players known to have suffered from CTE, a condition only diagnosable post-mortem, a disproportionate number have been enforcers who played limited minutes and as a result made far fewer hits than took fists to the head, and these are just the enforcers who've died. Many struggle with mental decline. Former Minnesota Wild enforcer Matt Johnson retired during the 2004-05 lockout due to being in constant pain and struggling with painkiller abuse. Shortly after he began displaying erratic behavior, fled his family's home and went missing. Today it is believed he is living homeless on the beaches of Santa Monica, California, having squandered his NHL earnings, And many of these cases only come to light when a player dies, like Gino Ogic, like Todd Ewan.
Not just with the issue of CTE, but the possibility that he could have had almost full-on Alzheimer's in 3 years. That's hard to take. It really is. It's knowing that he may not even remember me in 3 years' time, or any of his children, or the rest of the family and fans.
Hockey has been soul-searching for some time with regards to violence, not even because of fighting, but two infamous incidents that occurred just before the lockout. One between two enforcers that wasn't a fight, and one between two players essentially removed from the world of enforcing altogether. Even before the meteor of the 2004-05 lockout entered the atmosphere of the enforcer's planet, the moment Marty McSorley tomahawk chocked Donald Brashear in the temple, leaving Brashear having a seizure on the ice in February 2000, or the moment Todd Bertuzzi jumped Steve Moore, punched him in the back of the head and fell atop of him with half the Canucks and Avalanche roster, ending Steve Moore's career, the days of gratuitous violence were done. And to round back to Matt Rempe, the lovable, gangly, likeable enforcer, he's already elbowed several players in the head in a series of egregious hits. And much like the McSorley incident or the Bertuzzi incident, there are still people who will defend these actions. Moore deserved it because of his hit on Naslund, Brashear refused to fight McSorley after running over Byron Defoe, and Rempe, while his hits have been nowhere near as egregious, there are no shortage of folk online who just claim that's old school hockey. Siegenthaler pulled out of the hit, which is a baffling take. Most players attempt to avoid the hit. It's the job of the hitter not to stick out a leg or a knee or a chicken wing to make contact. And the people defending those hits ultimately lead me back to Rempemania.
This used to happen all the time. The new kid came up and he did the tour.
It was a lot of the usual, the beta stuff. You're a beta male who wants hockey to be boring, whatever, all that.
And you're going cowboy style, old school style, 80s, 90s style.
People seem like it's like this old school mentality where Toe Blake would have done it, and it's like, well, who gives a crap what Toe Blake would have done? It's 2024. Let's make the game better than it was in the 1930s.
Could not care less about fighting and these type of players. Players who play 5 minutes a game and just fight everyone. That is not why I watch hockey.
I look at the Matt Rempe phenomenon and just kind of I wonder if Matt Rempe sort of causes a generational divide.
Maybe you should watch soccer. We don't need this beta male mentality in hockey. Hockey is soft now. I'm sure you have all seen these types of refrains online. For a certain portion of hockey fandom, hockey and violence are one and the same, all boiled down into one gumbo of pure entertainment, and it is either going soft, going woke, or was better in insert commenter's childhood. Some have managed to wrap violence in hockey into the ever-consuming culture war by people with persistent brain rot incapable of discussion without ad hominems and jingoism. Don't you fucking dare question the sport I love. Nostalgia colours all of our perceptions. I still remember GoldenEye 64 as having incredibly realistic graphics, or at least I did until I played it on an emulator this year. I still love playing PSX and PSX throwback games because there is a wistfulness in those low poly graphics. You will often see people say Insert X was the best era of hockey, and I often wonder if they go back and actually watch hockey from those eras. I mean, you can. There's vintage footage of the NHL all over YouTube. There's footage from as early as the 1920s through to the modern day. Almost a century of archived footage. Go watch a game. Maybe you'll still feel the same way like a retro gamer who finds ceaseless comfort in the familiar patterns of their youth. Or maybe you'll realise that nostalgia has coloured your perception. The players in the 70s were warriors. They didn't even need helmets. I mean, they did. The death of Bill Masterton in 1968 sealed that. Players are soft now. I even see retired players espousing this, and there's no denying the game has changed, but hockey is a different beast today. Players are bigger, faster, and harder hitting as a result. They play on faster skates and better ice surfaces. They play with composite sticks that can flex and bend in a way that would burst a wooden stick in milliseconds. Shots are orders of magnitude faster because of this. The improvement in padding means players block shots differently. Players would rarely drop to the ice to block shots back in the good old days. Old school enforcers weren't fighting guys conditioned like they are today, gym rats jacked up on years of weight training. Imagine fighting 200 times against guys who have spent 20 plus hours a week in the gym. Imagine what that would do to your brain. Probert was fighting hard men, but hockey players back in Probert's day weren't spending all day every day in the gym. Hockey was certainly dirtier then, and the ceaseless grapple and hold of the 90s generated some eye-bleedingly slow games. There's no doubt players are poorer at protecting themselves today, almost a full sense of security. They take less hits in peewee and midget hockey and subsequently don't learn to receive a hit, and conversely, players don't learn how to deliver them. Players turn neck first into the boards, which is a recipe for disaster, and as such the physicality has had to adapt. But players are still hitting, players are still fighting. The staged fights of old have given way to silly fights after clean hits.
Qualm with it, if I had to pick anything, isn't the fighting itself. It's the fighting after clean hits is one thing that just grinds my gears every day of the week, because we say we want hitting in hockey, right? Nobody wants hockey to be soft or anything like that. You hear it constantly, right? If you say, oh, that was a dirty hit, that shouldn't be in the game, then immediately you want the game soft. But when you have fights after clean hits, it kind of takes away the argument for clean hits in hockey.
Modern players are generally smarter about avoiding potentially momentum-changing fights. Grapple and hold has largely been litigated out of the game, and believe me, that is a positive thing. But none of that stops the gatekeeping. There will always be acidic mouthpieces who will defend patently dirty plays as if it's some treasure of the past. That's how the good old boys played hockey. I've already covered in the last section why that can't happen, but these types of fans are also the ultimate happy clappers. They will cheer for a guy as long as he's on the ice and then forget about them and the lasting effects of their career when they're retired, or wave it away because they're millionaires now. Brent Sopel complains the NHL doesn't offer enough support for players after their careers, and I don't doubt he's right. But let's not pretend the Hockey Has Gone Soft Brigade care any more about the physical toll players take for their entertainment after their career has ended, beyond an RIP post on Facebook when their once favourite enforcer dies in his 50s. Once a player retires, they forget and move on to the next one, and unfortunately this mentality is bolstered by many of the sports media personalities who talk about enforcers with some kind of nostalgic, heady glee.
And he said every now and then, he'd be dressing next to Dave, and Dave would be getting dressed, and he'd turn to Marty and say, Marty, every now and then we must remind them. Tonight, we remind them. And Marty knew it was go time, because Dave had a feel of, okay, you got to establish the rep.
There's a belief that someone like me or someone important like Mark Lazarus raises any of these issues. We are advocating for the removal of all violence from hockey. Hockey will be a non-contact sport soon. Seriously, people who say stuff like that can fuck off. You're not a serious person or an adult if you knee-jerk your way through every discourse in life. I love a good fight when it serves a purpose. I'd be a hypocrite if I said I didn't stand up when players drop their gloves. I love seeing players lay good, clean hits to remove players from the puck. But violence for the sake of violence doesn't do anything for me because we now know the potential life-changing implications. And if violence for the sake of violence is what you want, rather than me go watch golf, why don't you go watch UFC or boxing, sports where fighting is properly regulated? Why don't we get rid of the puck and just place collapsible chairs around the edge of the rink? Just make it WrestleMania on ice. It is possible to enjoy fighting and still acknowledge their repercussions. That's the duality of man. They're not mutually exclusive standpoints. In fact, if more people adopted this stance instead of foaming at the mouth on either side of the debate, maybe we could move forward, place protocols to make things better for players moving forward, and still have fighting in the game. But instead it just feels like we're perpetually kicking the can down the road until some class action lawsuit truly kills the game. I love hockey because it's arguably the most multifaceted sport in the world. I love hockey in the same way I love hurling and Aussie rules, sports that all blend speed, aggression and skill. To say violence is hockey and hockey is violence is reductive of the sport itself. And I guess saying that makes me woke. Just clap and cheer or go and watch golf like a beta cuck. Yet here I am, a lifelong hockey fan who grew up on a steady diet of goon-laden British hockey, writing an 8,000-word script about this subject, while the people who don't want to talk seriously about this subject will engage in Facebook arguments against anyone they see as outsiders who don't get it, trying to change their game. Violence will always have a place in hockey, and to say there will be no contact, that's the way society is going, is evidence that you're just too far gone in the sauce. It's probably some sort of deep state conspiracy. I'm some kind of government plant. It's a false flag. Crisis actors are playing in the NHL pretending to be concussed. It's that level of stupidity being employed, and it's no surprise that many who bemoan the state of the modern game often lead hard into the other less palatable sides of internet discourse. Violence in hockey has become a generational divide, but contrary to all violence and no violence perceptions, it's rather more nuanced. Like every subject that gets dragged into the all-enveloping culture war, there are older hockey fans who prefer the game today. There are younger hockey fans who will obsessively watch hockey fights from the 90s. I'm not young. I don't advocate for no-contact hockey. I advocate for discourse, and I advocate against anyone who tries to shut down discourse or gatekeep the sport. I advocate, like Brent Sopel, for better support for players after their careers. Ex-athletes have a lot of time to fill after their careers, regardless of their wealth, and regardless of any injury sustained, you also have to find meaning, otherwise it's easy to slip into substance abuse and depression. It's a common story for many retired sports people. I advocate for the NHL to tackle the evidence of CTE in the sport head on, rather than dance around it, because if they don't, it will become a non-contact sport. There are those excited that Rempemania heralds a new arms race in the NHL as everyone tools up with enforcers, the first horseman of an enforcer apocalypse. But honestly, I don't think there are enough pure enforcers out there anymore who wouldn't be a total liability in the NHL. Ultimately, and somewhat contrary to what I just said, Rempemania wasn't a phenomenon indulged in just by older fans. Rempemania crossed demographic divides. Rangers fans who have no idea about legendary Rangers pugilists like Nick Fachu, fans seeing their first pure enforcer, fighting stands heralding Rempe as a beachhead for a glorious, more violent NHL future. Rempemania proved that hockey has missed the goons of old, that fans will always hold these types of players dear. Even fans of other teams were swept up in the phenomena. At least until the likeable, affable kids started landing increasingly egregious hits. When it was obvious Rempe was taking damage on his mission to land himself a longer NHL stay, when it became obvious that there is a subset of hockey fandom that wasn't so keen on the violence, and then, randomly, we started seeing comparisons to another skyscraper of NHL history.
Rempe's bigger than everybody. Chara was bigger than everybody. Zdeno Chara knew how to hit like a big man.
It's very hard for me to be hypocritical of what he's doing since I tried to do a very similar thing. I also did an elbow like 3 kids in the head in my first 3 weeks in the league.
And he didn't destroy people out there.
I find it baffling that this comparison keeps being made. Matt Rempe and Zdeno Chara are wildly different players. Chara cannot be used as an analogue for Rempe's continued progress. One was a rangy defenseman who was a linchpin on the blue line of any team he played on, skated over 20 minutes a night and played over 1,600 NHL games and has at some point got to be a Hall of Famer. The other is a meat and potatoes fourth liner with poorer skating and limited upside, who just happens to be tall. I know Rempe is a rookie. I know when Chara was a rookie he wasn't spectacular. I am an Islanders fan. I do remember him as a rookie. Chara also only put up 1 point in 25 games in his first season. But the comparison is the most baseline, like comparing a diplodocus and a giraffe and going, look, they're both tall. Of course, the reason these comparisons are frequently made is that Chara played nearly 1,600 games as the tallest player in NHL history, and Matt Rempe is currently the tallest NHL player. And yet Chara managed to make it through that career without elbowing players every week.
How hard it is for big men to hit cleanly.
Yes.
How Zdeno Chara did not end up with at least one Lady Byng trophy. Not for how he behaved, but for what he didn't do.
Montreal fans will obviously cite Chara's hit on Max Pacioretty as an example of Chara being dirty. But that wasn't an elbow. Chara ran him into the divide between the benches. At his current pace of play with his 5 minutes a night, Matt Rempe would have to play about 7,000 games to reach Chara's career minutes, yet doesn't seem to be able to employ the restraint that Chara did throughout his career. Because make no bones about it, had Chara played like Rempe, he would have been suspended out of the league. Chara could have fucking destroyed opponents nightly had he wanted to, and didn't. Rempe doesn't seem to be able to exercise that restraint, and frankly I find that worrying because Rempe is still young. He will get bigger, not taller but heavier. Chara certainly did. Chara played with an enormous amount of restraint. There comes a point in hockey where height becomes a disadvantage, and yet Chara managed to navigate this and solidify himself as one of the greatest defensemen of his generation. Now, the counter-argument is that players were generally bigger in Chara's day, that the elimination of enforcers and grappling holders made the NHL populated by players like Logan Stankoven. But Chara was playing in the era of Martin St. Louis. The average height and size of players is little changed today as it was in Chara's prime. Players today average around 6'1", 6'2", and generally weigh just under 200 pounds. At Chara's peak in 2008-09, when Chara logged his career high in points, players averaged about the same in height and were marginally heavier at around 205 pounds. And so, no, Rempe is not analogous with Zdeno Chara. But like Chara's rookie year, where he scored just 1 point in 25 games, Rempe has plenty of room to improve. I just don't see that comparison. Who I do see a comparison with was one of the next tallest players in the NHL during Chara's heyday. A player I've mentioned already. Hell, he's in my thumbnail. A player who had a long history with Zdeno Chara and a player for whom I have a signed photograph of, for anyone who thinks I am not a fan of enforcers. The player I'm speaking about is Peter Worrell. Worrell is often cited at 6'7", sometimes 6'6". You could argue Rempe is similar to Derek Bugard, who was listed at 6'7", but honestly, I think Matt Rempe is a considerably better hockey player than Derek Bugard ever was. But like Worrell, Rempe is a limited skater, kind of lumbering on the ice, but like Rempe, had shown some offensive upside in his junior career. There is a hockey player in there, but like Worrell, I don't think anywhere near good enough to have made him an NHLer on merit. And like Rempe, Peter Worrell had to change his game to make it in the NHL, and like Rempe, Worrell loved to lay late hits. Except in his era, it was just part of the game. So what is the shelf life of Rempemania? Well, short of every team tooling up with old school heavyweights, not long. Even Rempe recognises that he needs to bring more to the table next season, and his fights began tapering off towards the end of the regular season because it just isn't sustainable. But as long as he remains a popular cult figure in Rangers lore, there's a chance he could carve out a long NHL career. It's just hard to imagine that freight train of popularism will last long enough without significant improvement in his game, and it's hard to imagine if he decides to keep up the play of his early NHL career, he will remain healthy long enough to have a lengthy career. I'm not saying Rempe is following the path of Bugard, I hope he isn't, but he is a player who has had to follow a certain route into the NHL, and against the guys who throw like they do today with years of weight training and gym conditioning, fighting most games, or even a quarter of the games, just isn't sustainable. Teams take their duty of care towards players much more seriously these days. Rempemania in and of itself just isn't sustainable. It may continue on into the early part of next season, but it's hard to escape the feeling that beyond anything else, Rempemania is a fad that will die down. He will always remain a cult figure, but the enduring popularity of the last enforcers, the Derek Bugards, the John Scotts, and the Colton Orrs, were that there was an environment, however rarefied, in which their cult status could thrive. And once that environment became unviable, they died off. And in the intervening decades since, we have learned why this can no longer be a player's only trait, not just because of the changes in the game, but in changes in medical knowledge. It's obvious Matt Rempe has felt like he had to carve a certain path into the NHL, and it worked. It's now up to him to find a different gear in himself, because otherwise he's a dinosaur in a league speeding away from the era he could have belonged. I know this is a divisive topic, but I feel it's one people dance around so much in this sport, and it's one that has so many bad actors trying to poison the well. While it may come off as me disliking him, I don't. Matt Rempe the kid seems like a lovable guy. It may seem like I'm against fighting, but I'm not, in the right circumstances. It may seem like I'm against violence, but I'm not, in the context of the game. The game is inherently violent, in that stratosphere of the highest contact sports alongside rugby, hurling and Aussie rules, but with the added speed of the ice. Some of my favourite players in the late 90s were enforcers, particularly Peter Worrell and Scott Parker. If there is one thing I'd like anyone to take away from this video, is that it is possible to be a fan of fighting in the game and also question its viability.
Oh god, we have to talk about Matt Rempe, don't we?
Yeah, we do have to talk about Matt Rempe.
This Rempe thing may be going a little bit too far. Again, the first couple of games, it was fun. It's this new kid who's trying to establish himself in the league.
The general consensus is that he can't make the NHL on talent.
But it's still, you ask any player in the league, it still has its place. And in the case of Rempe, ask and you receive.
I'm pretty sure many won't make it to the end of the video, but for those that have and heard me out, regardless of your stance on the topic, I thank you. If you did enjoy the video, well, enjoy maybe isn't the right phrase. If you tolerated the video, please like and subscribe. It helps me and all the content creators you enjoy rise above the algorithm. I promise I do have cheerier content planned, but for now I am going back to sea as I work in the Merchant Navy, so there may be a little delay on my next video. Hopefully not, I am trying to schedule ahead, but until next time, enjoy the off season.